My name is Marlene Epp, and I am the interim dean here at Conrad Grebel University College, and I'm also part of the Mennonite Studies program here. I welcome you on behalf of the faculty, staff, and administration here at Conrad Grebel. And I'm delighted to host you for the 2016 Bechtel Lectures in Anabaptist Mennonite Studies, featuring Dr. Janneken Smucker, who I'll introduce later on. So to tell you a bit about the history of the Bechtel Lecture Series and recognize the Bechtel family, I'll invite up our president, Dr. Susan Schulz-Huxman.
Thank you, Marlene. Yes, welcome tonight to Conrad Grebel, to the Great Hall, and we're going to hear a great presentation with Dr. Janneken Smucker. I would like, however, to take this occasion to recognize the inspiration and the originator of the Bechtel Lecture Series. Lester Bechtel, unfortunately, cannot be here tonight, but his family is here. So I would ask them to stand, Bruce and Diane and Deb. I want to tell you a little bit about them. And then I want us to clap again for the inspiration. Unfortunately, Lester could not be with us tonight. He tried coming last night and unfortunately had a mishap getting out of the car and was unable to participate, but we really do appreciate his support, and I want to tell you just briefly about that. 16 years ago, Lester Bechtel had a visionary and generous idea, and it was an idea honed and then eventually hatched with then-President John E. Taves in 2001. And it was to fund special programming at Conrad Grebel that would do two things: bridge the academic world and the church world by attracting speakers and presenters and performers who could share the practical side of their academic work to a larger community, church community and wider community. So that was one purpose. The second was to help raise the visibility of Mennonite studies here at Conrad Grebel. It's one of our 4 distinctive programs. Well, the Bechtel Lecture Series has done both over the years, and tonight's speaker is adept at combining the world of art and the world of the Academy. So I want to thank Lester and the Bechtel family again for their abiding support of this fine lecture series for 16 years in a row. I want to mention just very briefly that the Bechtel Lecture is especially important to us because we have passed a new strategic plan called Extending the Grebel Table, where we want to engage growing constituencies around continuing education, and one of the best ways we can do that is to highlight and to profile and to extend the reach of Mennonite studies. So I don't know how many of you have had an opportunity yet to contribute to the Grebel Annual Fund. Our deadline is not until April 30th, so if this year you would like to give special attention to Mennonite studies, again in concert with our new strategic plan, we would very much appreciate that. And Marlene and Maureen are going to tell you a little bit more about why things are so special at Conrad Grebel in terms of Mennonite studies and the archives. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. So around the room, on either behind me and over there and at the back, you see a few Mennonite and Amish quilts and some Hmong textiles. Last night, in a special fundraising event for the Mennonite Studies program, Janneken Smucker tested us on our ability to differentiate Amish from non-Amish quilts. Some of us did better than others, I think, and I think most of us gave up towards the end. So I should be able to identify which of these quilts are Amish and which of them are not. Are any of them Amish? She's shrugging her shoulders. But as we also learned, there is not a clear definition for that. And that's what makes Janneken's research so interesting. So these pieces are part of a larger exhibit that is now showing on our 2nd floor atrium and upwards to the 4th floor. So I invite you to stay after the lecture for a reception in the atrium, where you can also wander about and see more quilts with descriptions about their ownership and who made them. For gathering this exhibit together, I want to offer thanks to Ardith Fry, Arlene Martin, Laverne Martin, Rosella Lees, Molly Mua, and especially to Fred Martin for initiating this exhibit and making it happen. We have several other wonderful exhibits that you might want to view tonight or at a later date when you come back. And so I'm going to invite up Laureen Harder-Gissing, our archivist, librarian, and also director of the Institute of Anabaptist and Mennonite Studies, to tell you about these briefly.
For those of us who have worked at or visited Grebel this week, we've enjoyed looking at many beautiful things around the college. And I'm here to tell you about how you can continue to look at beautiful things at Grebel through the library and archives. Some of you may have library cards at Grebel. If you don't, they're free to residents of Ontario. And if you enjoy what you hear tonight, you can actually take a little piece of Janneken home with you and continue to enjoy her work through some of our library books that we have here. And at the Mennonite Archives of Ontario, you can continue to look at other beautiful things that we have representing Mennonite history and heritage in this province. We have rare Anabaptist books. One of them is approaching its 500th birthday. We have family history, personal histories, institutional and organizational histories, congregational histories, histories of special events, and histories of everyday life. We acquire and preserve these materials that you bring into us, and we help researchers of any kind and provide educational events for interested groups. Tonight, there's a special little pop-up exhibit out in the reception area that you'll be in following the lecture. And in that area, you can see an exhibit of the work of Nancy Lou Patterson, the first chair of the Fine Arts Department here at the university, and also the creator of the famous Grebel Chapel windows. So you can look and learn a little bit more about her quilt research. We have an ongoing exhibit in the library and archives on the 3rd floor about the 75th anniversary of conscientious objection, with featured stories created by our students about the Conchies and their alternative service. That goes all the way to December, so you have plenty of time to look at that. And finally, our sister gallery upstairs on the 4th floor in the Center for Peace Advancement is the Grebel Gallery. And currently, they also have a quilt exhibit ongoing until the end of April. So lots of things to come and look at, and I hope you will do just that.
So this seems to be the winter of events at Conrad Grebel, the winter of special lectures. And before I introduce our guest tonight, I just want to tell you about 2 upcoming lectures that will undoubtedly be of interest to you as well. So on March 1st, we will hear from the preeminent Scottish composer and conductor, Sir James Macmillan, who is this year's Rodney and Lorna Sawatsky Visiting Scholar. He'll be doing a lecture here in this hall, and later in the week, a concert in the community. On March 31st, our own Dr. Troy Osborne, a professor of history and theological studies here, is delivering the annual Benjamin Eby Lecture. His title is The Bottle, the Dagger, and the Ring, Church Discipline and Dutch Mennonite Identity in the 17th Century. So please check out our website for details, and we hope to see you back for those events. Well, now to our featured Bechtel lecturer for this year. So there's an increasing number of Mennonites who have blogs on the internet. I think it's their way of being private and public all at the same time. And there was recently a blog titled The Quilt Maker's Guilt. See, some of us feel guilty because we don't quilt. I think that was her main point, but she said, quilts we like to think are as Mennonite as rhubarb plots. And maybe they are, except that the plots-making Mennonites are the kind who came through Russia, and the quilt-making ones are the kind that came through Pennsylvania. And lots of people with no connection whatsoever to Mennonites also make quilts and eat rhubarb desserts. And I'm just going to add to that, and there are some Mennonites, like the Hmong, whose handwork over here is like a quilt in its beauty and functionality. So who better to help us figure all this out than Dr. Janneken Smucker? And so I'm pleased to welcome and introduce her. Dr. Smucker is here from Westchester University in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, which is not far from Philadelphia where she lives. She's a professor of digital and public history and American material culture there. Her book, Amish Quilts, Crafting an American Icon, published in 2013 and featured in the New York Times gift guide for the year, is itself beautifully crafted, visually and intellectually. Janneken's questions go beyond what differentiates the log cabin versus the double wedding ring quilt design to explore the cultural and consumer meanings of Mennonite and Amish quilts and Hmong textiles. She has contributed to numerous quilt-related book projects and exhibits, and is president of the board of the Quilt Alliance in the US. She is also a fifth-generation quilt maker. You can read more about her in the program. Welcome, Janneken.
Thank you so much, Marlene, for that lovely introduction, and thank you to the entire Grebel community for making me feel so at home these past few days. I've really enjoyed the visit here, and I'm looking forward to spending the evening here with you as well. Before I really get into the meat of my lecture, I want to tell you just a little bit about myself. As Marlene said, I'm a fifth-generation Mennonite quilt maker. These days, it's hard for me to find time to actually ever finish anything, but if I'm patient enough, I'll eventually finish a quilt again. I began making quilts when I was a teenager. I knew how to sew from a fairly young age. My mother had a sewing machine and then introduced me to it, and I loved always having a project to work on. So one summer, I think I was about 16, I decided I was going to make a quilt. And I pulled this book off my mother's shelf called How to Make a Sampler Quilt. Sampler is a type of quilt that each block in it is a different pattern. And so I had so much fun picking out these patterns, going to the fabric store, choosing exactly the colors and the patterns that I wanted to bring into this first quilt. And I was really hooked. I really loved the entire process, cutting, stitching things together, and then it wasn't that same summer, but I think a summer or so later when we set up the quilting frame. This is my great-grandmother's quilting frame that you see my mother and my grandmother quilting with me in our dining room, finishing my first quilt, which is the quilt that still is on my bed. Probably I shouldn't admit just how tattered it is now. I'm a historian, I should know how to preserve things better, but I'm also someone who loves to actually sleep under a quilt and use it. You also see here me while I'm in college with my grandmother and her first quilt that she made in the 1920s. It was very much the convention for young Mennonite girls in eastern Ohio where she grew up. To learn how to quilt, make their first quilt in their late teens, early 20s before they were married. And I'm lucky enough to have that quilt in my own very meager personal collection of quilts. But I was really fascinated by this art. It was beautiful, tactile. I loved color and fabric, so it was a great fit for me. And then meanwhile, I went to Goshen College in my hometown in Goshen, Indiana. I studied history and women's studies, but didn't quite know that all of those things related. I even quilted in my college house, setting up a quilt frame for my friends to come over and help me out. And I remember reviewing a quilt exhibit in the college newspaper. But But I didn't know that I could study quilts as my academic pursuit until a few years later when I headed back to graduate school and realized there was this field called material culture studies where you study objects and understand their resonance and what they mean in a culture. And that's what I began to do with quilts. I first earned my master's degree at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, which is home to the world's largest publicly held collection of quilts, and that's at the International Quilt Study Center and Museum. So if you're traveling across the United States on Interstate 80, it's right off of 80, not too far, and it's a really state-of-the-art museum and collection facility, study center for quilts from all over the world. Their goal is to collect from every corner of the globe. So you see Hmong textiles, you see many minority groups from around the world, many ethnic groups have similar quilt making traditions. It's really remarkable that we share so much in the cloth. But they also have a really remarkable collection of Amish quilts, close to 400 Amish quilts, and those are the quilts that I began to study as a graduate student. Learning their patterns and the fabrics and the weave structures and the regional differences, and also began to ask questions. Why do we hang these on walls rather than put them on beds? Why are we keeping them preserved in the state-of-the-art storage facility with the perfect level of humidity, wrapped in acid-free tissue paper? And why are they worth so much money? Because I also began to get to know the collectors and the dealers who bought and sold these objects. And so my questions started to shift, not just from what pattern is this quilt, which community was it made in, but why do we value quilts so much? Why have they become something that was once relegated to a cedar chest, and now we hang them on walls and treat them like works of art? So I began to explore these questions. Before 1971, no one bothered pairing the adjective Amish with the noun quilt. Few people outside Amish settlements knew that there was anything distinct about the types of patchwork bed covers that Amish families kept folded in their cedar chests or displayed on their guest beds. The Amish themselves just called them quilts, or their Pennsylvania German word, Debek. But in 1997, when the noted art critic Robert Hughes wrote his sweeping survey of American art history, he called Amish quilts, quote, America's first major abstract art. And he pictured this early 20th century quilt, which is attributed to Rebecca Fisher Stolzfus from Rothdale in Lancaster County in Pennsylvania. And within this mere quarter of a century, from 1971 to 1997, these objects had shifted in status from pure obscurity within a relatively closed religious community to artworks considered by a prestigious critic as precursors to great modern American abstract paintings. Today, Amish quilts regularly appear in arenas quite distinct from one another. We see Amish quilts hanging on walls of art museums where curators and visitors alike treat them as works of art of the highest caliber. And by contrast, quilts also regularly appear in small country stores located in Amish and Mennonite settlements. And here one can find quilts stacked horizontally on beds, hanging vertically over bars, and also hung on the walls like paintings. And they also sell piles of pillows and quillos, which is a combination quilt and pillow, pot holders, placemats, tote bags, wall hangings, all purported to be pieced and quilted by Amish women. Few of these objects, all of these things are collectively Amish quilts, bear much resemblance to the older quilts that we saw before, like this one by Rebecca Fisher Stolzfus. Yet these quilts and quilted objects, which are marketed to tourists visiting Amish country, are also typically made by unnamed Amish makers, as well as by unnamed women of other religious and ethnic backgrounds. So what do these two quilts have in common? The one sold at Country Lane Quilts, and the one that hangs on the wall of a museum, other than attribution to a maker of the same Anabaptist faith? As I explored that question, and many others, my research stretched from the period during which Amish women first began making quilts in the late 19th century, as they adapted commercially available patterns and innovated their own quilt-making styles that fit their community standards. I placed the Amish and their quilts within a context of consumer culture, a context in which they are no stranger today thanks to forces including tourism and reality television. But their quilts were also products of consumer culture, made from factory-produced cloth, often from commercially available patterns. In the late 1960s, artists and art enthusiasts, quote, discovered Amish quilts. And before long, oh, here you can see some of the comparisons they would make between paintings by minimalists like Joseph Albers, pop artists like Victor Vasarely, and they made these links that the quilts looked so much like the types of art that were popular in the 1960s. Before long, the Amish began catering to outsiders, making quilts and home-based cottage industries to sell to tourists visiting Amish country. The term Amish functioned much like a brand name. It added value to the quilts by signifying their quality and their authenticity. But unlike a trademark, whose owner can legally prevent unauthorized use of the name, Amish was free for anyone to use, no matter what product they sold. When it came to selling quilts, Amish turned into an adjective that at times had nothing to do with who made the product. So how did all of this happen? When does this story begin? If you ask an Amish woman when the Amish began quilting, she will likely tell you that the Amish have always quilted. Today, quilts are among the objects most specifically associated with the Old Order Amish, but Amish quilt making is actually a relatively recent phenomenon. For decades after many of their neighbors began making quilts, the Amish continued to use the bedding, which was common to their Germanic heritage, a chaff bag, which was a very loose, often linen cloth stuffed with straw, a feather bed, and then perhaps a decorative woven coverlet on the top. However, during the mid to late 19th century, Amish women in settlements in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois began to make quilts. And here are two of the earliest identified Amish quilts that have dates actually stitched into the fabric. On the left, this pieced quilt from Topeka, Indiana, is dated 1875. And the one on the right, which unfortunately is actually in two pieces, was also probably from Indiana. That's where it was found. It was dated 1868. So how and when did the Amish begin making quilts? I wish I could tell you. We just don't know. But ever since Amish quilts became very popular and very studied outside of their origins, beginning in the 1970s, people have been speculating about what may have inspired these quilts. Many of the details are, in fact, likely lost to history because we don't have that diary of the Amish woman who recounts going down to her neighbor's home and seeing a quilt and learning how to make it. But since outsiders began paying attention, these authors have written about Amish women borrowing the quilt-making practices of their English, non-German-speaking neighbors, about the design sources for patterns, perhaps the fields and the fences, and about a linear evolution of quilt patterns from very simple to complex. Regardless of from whom Amish women learned the craft, it was likely an innovator within the community, someone who was sort of brave and pushing at the boundaries, who first adopted the practice. Quilt making likely began in earnest after Amish settlers found new communities in western outposts, rather than originating in eastern Pennsylvania and then transplanting with new communities. We speculate that mostly because the traditions really differ from region to region. The craft requires an excess of fabric as well as time to laboriously piece and quilt. These are resources abundant really only after settlements on the frontier were firmly established. The Amish had already founded settlements in central and western Pennsylvania by the last quarter of the 18th century, and some Amish from these newer Pennsylvania settlements had moved further west to Ohio by 1808, and others began founding settlements even further west, Indiana, as well as Canada, settlements soon to follow. Many of these Amish pioneers settled in close proximity to other Germanic groups, especially to other Mennonites. Intermingling, of course, occurred at church, at school, and in commerce, and perhaps quilt making spread through a social network of German-speaking friends and relatives, or as some scholars have theorized, across ethnicity, perhaps learning from Welsh quilt makers or Quakers or other English neighbors. By exploring how Amish communities have experienced gradual change in adoption of other daily life practices, we can hypothesize how women adopted this new cultural practice of making quilts. Typically, individuals have been the instigators of change, pushing the community from its edges to adopt objects and practices and technologies outside of the group's normal range of conformity. So this might be buttons rather than hooks and eyes on clothing, electric lights on buggies, or a decorative molding in a bedroom, and quilts instead of coverlets. These new fashions, however, were typically so far out of date in the rest of society, and so they didn't really have any effect on the separation between the Old Order Amish and other members of the mainstream community. So one Amish bishop said, well, change just kind of happens. So it happens when someone on the periphery of the Amish community adopts a new cultural practice and it meets with little complaint. If others also adopt the practice, it soon became acceptable, perhaps even the default. Likely, an innovator within the Amish community learned to quilt in the mid to late 19th century, borrowing patterns and techniques either from friends or neighbors of non-Amish sectarian groups like the Mennonites or Church of the Brethren, or perhaps from these other groups like Quakers or Welsh. And as other friends and relatives saw their quilts, they soon adapted the practices as well, and quilt making, sooner or later, became common. Yet no one outside the Amish community really paid attention to these quilts until the late 1960s. At that time, to young art enthusiasts, Amish quilts were indeed a discovery. They were a new, authentic art form that fit into the visual culture of modern art with which they were already well-versed. The quilt's resemblance to paintings of artists like Mark Rothko and Joseph Albers, along with their convenient apartment wall size and relatively low price, made them appealing to urbanites eager to hang a work of art on the wall. When Jonathan Holstein and Gail Vanderhoof, a couple who formed one of the foremost collections of Amish quilts during the 1970s, bought their first one in 1968, they were not alone in their aesthetic appreciation, the merits of old bed coverings. Beginning in the 60s and increasingly in the 1970s, artists, art critics, antique dealers, exhibition curators, feminists, and other cultural entrepreneurs reinterpreted quilts as art objects. They moved off the bed and onto the walls. And this new perception was part of a larger cultural conversation about tradition, craft making, and aesthetics that was occurring both among urban and rural people and inside and outside of academic and art world circles. Part of the attraction to quilts in general during this time period, during the 70s, was purely aesthetic. Was it a coincidence that a lively patchwork quilt and the tumbling blocks looked so much like op art at the same time? The repeated baskets in this quilt formed from bits of red fabric running across the surface of the quilt reminded these art enthusiasts of Andy Warhol's penchant for repetition. They compared Kenneth Nolan's manipulation of color. His late 1960s paintings often featured parallel stripes running horizontally along the width of a landscape-shaped canvas to the visual effects created by the repeated stripes on this Pennsylvania rainbow quilt. And these quilts, which were created in 2 dimensions on a similar scale to the large paintings generated by New York's abstract artists, were typically made 50 to 100 years earlier than their painted counterparts. In 1968, during one trip through Pennsylvania's Lancaster County on Route 30, Holstein and Vanderhoof, this couple I've introduced you to, were escaping from New York to visit the countryside. They stopped at a small antique shop. They had begun buying old quilts because they loved their strong graphics. They looked great hanging on the walls of their New York apartment. In this shop, they spotted what they considered an unusual quilt covering the springs of a brass bed. The proprietor wanted to sell the quilt and bed as a lot, asking $11 for the 2 pieces. Holstein recounts, "I said to the guy, I really just want to buy the quilt. After considering for a moment, the proprietor agreed, charging the couple $5.75. They brought it home to their New York apartment, and here I'd like you to listen to Holstein recount what happened.
We looked at that quilt in New York, and at first thinking that it was just some extraordinary work of genius, and then after looking at it for a week, realizing that it was too precise, the materials were too consistent, the quilting was too consistent for it to be a singular example from any culture that we knew anything about, American culture. So we carried around it or pictures of it for a long time until someone finally said, oh yeah, that's an Amish quilt. So then we thought, well, how are we going to get more of these? So if there's one like, I said, are they all, we asked them, are they like this? Yeah, they're like this. So I thought, oh my God, so how are we going to find more? So then we had to start looking around for Amish quilts. So slowly we began to find them. This would be now 1969 and 70.
Among the many quilts stitched from abundantly available printed cotton fabrics and repeated geometric block patterns that this couple would have seen, this quilt would have indeed stood out. Its wide borders were from a lush rust orange colored wool suiting fabric, and they framed the field of alternating green and orange strips of fabric, which Holstein called bars and the Amish called strema, Pennsylvania Dutch word for strips. Framing these strips was a narrow violet border that separated the design field from the outer border with an electric vibrancy. The binding holding the 3 layers of this quilt together echoed the green from the design field, sealing in what Holstein considered the quilt's perfect proportions, the balance between the outer border and the inner field. In the wide rust outer border, intricate stitches formed swirling feathers, and this curving ornament contrasted with both the rigid geometry of the strips and the fine cross-hatching quilting stitches that covered the alternating green and orange wools. These colors, combined with the simple lines of the quilt's design, would have seemed extraordinarily out of place compared to the busy prints found on most non-Amish quilts that the couple would have seen. To them, this quilt was a first clue that led them to pursue these bed covers as art objects. Holstein and Vanderhoof began to talk about quilts to anyone who would listen, including their artist friends in New York City, proselytizing about the aesthetic merits of old bed coverings, in an effort to convince the art world that the quilt's resemblance to paintings was not just an interesting coincidence, and that quilts were worth exploring as visual objects in their own right. In 1971, Holstein and Vanderhoof used their art world connections to convince the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York City to host Abstract Design in American Quilts, an exhibit featuring 60 of their quilts displayed on the large white walls of the newly opened Marcel Brauer Designed Museum. Hanging on the walls of the Whitney was an Amish quilt, that same bars quilt. In this slide it's difficult to see, but it's the furthest one on your right. That same bars quilt that they had bought for less than $6 in Lancaster County. The exhibit was hugely popular, praised by prominent art critics, attended by thousands, with the museum selling out its catalog and extending the exhibit's run. Soon, Amish quilts had become highly sought out cult objects, with stylish urbanites and rural collectors equally enamored. But why were these outsiders so enchanted by these quilts? In some ways, Amish quilts with their strong graphics and bold colors simply substituted for other works of abstract art. One Philadelphia antiques dealer who specialized in Amish quilts recalled that everyone, upon seeing the quilts hanging in the windows of her shop, would think they'd discover it. She'd say, "Oh my, look at these, they look just like modern art," and everyone who came to see these quilts would think that it was their discovery. But beyond the visual qualities, Amish quilts embodied a paradox of looking very modern while symbolically serving as a tangible reminder of tradition, authenticity, and rural values. Only within the context of a very self-conscious modernism could collectors and curators celebrate this paradox. In addition to collectors and museums, interior design magazines promoted how to use Amish quilts to capitalize on this paradox by combining modernism and tradition. House and Garden featured antique dealer Phyllis Hayter's white-walled, upscale New York City apartment covered with Amish quilts. That's what you see here. The magazine text read, quote, "The vivid colors of Amish quilts, often the only decorating to be found in Amish homes, are all the color this modern, light-filled room needs. Hung like contemporary paintings in Mr. and Mrs. Richard Hayter's city apartment, they enliven a setting designed to show off their dazzling geometrics," end quote. But why were the Amish, these individuals and families, so willing to sell their old quilts? Part of it was a cultural clash, and part of it was a change in Amish taste and preference. First, the clash in values. Because the Amish have strived to maintain a separation from the world, their values have often been at odds with those of mainstream society. Throughout the history of the Old Order Amish Church, these conflicting values have materially manifested themselves through Amish choices in appropriate dress and limited use of technology. In the case of quilts, when outsiders to the community brought their values to the objects, the Amish had to learn to adapt their own ideals to the situation. The Amish belief system frowns upon materialism, pride, and worldliness, which they understood within the community as the seeking of comforts and conveniences, the love of material things, and participation in self-enhancing activities. Once the values of the outside world had determined that their old quilts, with high monetary and aesthetic worth, conveyed ideals that ran against the grain of their own beliefs, this overshadowed any kind of sentimental meaning that was derived from the family ties. Let's listen to a Lancaster County Amish man explain how these beliefs influenced his co-religionist's decision to sell their old quilts.
I think it's because they had practical minds. The practical function of it was really gone. They were attached to them too much sentimentally to wear them out because they were heirlooms. And yet they were uncomfortable having a $10,000 quilt in their house.
Sure.
And so I guess it didn't mean that much to them that $10,000 or $5,000 or whatever, that the price couldn't buy it. It was a matter of practicalness. You know, if you don't keep art objects like that in your house, get rid of them, turn them into cash, pay your debts. You know.
Yeah, and that's other things you can
Yeah.
do with that amount of money.
And it's very different. It was not a, once they became a status symbol, then it was time to get rid of them. You know, basically.
Yeah. Further, Amish fashions had changed. By the 1970s, when outsiders became interested in Amish quilts, many of the Amish themselves were less enamored with the aesthetic qualities of what they referred to as old, dark quilts, featuring solid colored fabrics and geometric patterns. In addition, they considered them too small for their contemporary beds and too difficult to launder in their wools and natural fibers. Many had moved on to synthetic blend fabrics and cheery country patterns and lighter colors, like you see here. Yet they had a sentimental attachment to the old quilts, which were passed on as gifts between generations and displayed on beds on Sundays when they hosted church in their homes. With this increasing outsider interest, they began to see the role of quilts as part of their livelihood instead. And as land prices rose in many Amish communities, quilts became a replacement, a new sort of cash crop that they could make to fill the void as they farmed less and less. The market for new Amish-made quilts grew out of the interest in the old quilts. But the resulting products were much more diverse, made with new patterns, new materials, and new techniques. Most quilts made for the consumer market beginning in the 70s and 80s looked significantly different from those that the Amish women had made for their own families earlier in the 20th century. When produced for retail shops, most Amish-made quilts featured contemporary designs that changed with interior decorating trends. Amish quilt designers learned how to stay on top of these fashions by reading how-to quilt books, following industry publications, and even attending trade shows. One Amish businesswoman reported, quote, "We have to keep up with what colors are fashionable so we can make the changes from one year to the next," end quote. Retailers also needed to have a diverse inventory on hand to satisfy the varying tastes of their customers. Quote, "You get all kinds of people, so we try to do all kinds of quilts. Hopefully we do a quilt for everybody," said another businesswoman. Many tourists visiting Amish settlements wanted a quilt that was Amish made, but preferred other styles than the old quilts, and they would sometimes even bring in a sample from their drapes or their carpet so that they could have a quilt custom made to match. To these consumers, a quilt's Amish origins signified quality regardless of what the quilt looked like. And Amish businesswomen were happy to, quote, "give them whatever they want," end quote. One new pattern that took off among consumers had its origins in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. In 1983, Brides magazine came to Lancaster to profile an old home renovation for a newly married couple. The magazine decided it needed a custom-made quilt to take center stage in the bedroom and sought out the assistance of the Old Country Store, one of the largest fabric and quilt retail shops in Lancaster County. The manager at that time, Rachel Pellman, and her colleague, Craig Heisey, created a pattern featuring lovebirds based on the distal fink, which you might know from Fraktur, overlapping hearts, and undulating vines of tulips, drawing inspiration from the symbols frequently found on Pennsylvania German decorative arts of the 18th and 19th centuries. After the quilt appeared in Brides magazine, the Old Country Store began receiving frequent requests from quilt makers for the pattern. Initially, Pellman's staff sold photocopies of it for just a few dollars a piece before realizing that consumer demand warranted publishing the pattern and accompanying book of how to make the quilt. The staff at the Old Country Store followed up with a whole series of country bride patterns, including Country Lily, Country Love, and Country Songbird. The design fit perfectly with the American country aesthetic that was popular throughout the 1980s. And when the dominant interior design colors switched from blue and rose to salmon and green in the 90s, quilters could easily adapt the Country Bride series of patterns to follow. The success of the Country Bride quilt and its related country spin-offs ushered in many romantic applique patterns that have remained popular among consumers coming to buy quilts in Lancaster County. An applique is the technique of sewing a piece of fabric on top of a background fabric, where most Amish quilt makers tended to typically piece their quilts, which is stitching straight lines together. Demand for country-style applique quilts was so high among consumers, and not enough Amish seamstresses were skilled at the hand-stitching required for these intricate applique quilts. Luckily for Amish quilt businesses, the Hmong, new residents to the Lancaster County area, had the necessary sewing skills, experience selling their own textile arts, and a knack for learning and adapting others' cultural practices. The Hmong are a minority ethnic group, historically based in areas of present-day China, Vietnam, and Laos, with a tradition of fine needlework skills. Hmong women had long decorated ceremonial clothing, baby carriers like the ones you see here, and funeral accoutrements with embroidery, applique, and batik, three textile practices collectively known among Hmong clans as pan dao, which translates as flower cloth. While practices among various Hmong clans differed, they shared precise geometric forms, fine detailed stitching, and bold coloring. Traditionally, young girls learned pan dao techniques from watching their mothers, developing applique and embroidery skills along with abilities of manipulating symmetry, proportion, and color. Related among a textile tradition you might be familiar with is called story cloths, which is developed particularly as Hmong refugees have left Southeast Asia. Hmong refugees began immigrating to the United States in 1975, following the end of the Vietnam War. As part of U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia in the years leading up to the Vietnam War, the United States had provided financial and logistical support to what has become known as a CIA secret army consisting of Hmong and other minority groups from the highlands of Laos who fought against the region's communist armies, including the North Vietnamese. When the communist government declared victory in Laos in 1975, just as the U.S. military left the region, the Lao People's Democratic Republic began to target Hmong people, this minority group, rounding them up into concentration camps because they had fought alongside the Americans. Many Hmong attempted to escape Lao by crossing the Mekong River into refugee camps in Thailand, and that's what's depicted here. From these camps, Hmong refugees awaited asylum, with tens of thousands resettling in the United States during the late 1970s and 80s. Other refugees found asylum in Canada and Western Europe, although many have continued to live in Thai camps. In the refugee camps, Hmong came to rely on their traditional textile art as a primary source of income. They were accustomed to outsider interest in their pandao, having sold it to French colonials as early as the 1940s, and to American governmental advisors and missionaries working in Lao during the 1950s and 60s. During the 60s, prior to the mass exodus of Hmong refugees into Thailand following the war, a few nonprofit and Thai government-sponsored agencies began marketing various arts made by hill tribes, including the Hmong. With the establishment of refugee camps in the 1970s, aid agencies and missionary groups cultivated craft production among Hmong refugees in hopes that outsider interest in their pandao might provide families with a modest supplemental income. Aid groups brought pandao to urban markets in Thailand and exported pieces around the globe. Christian and Missionary Alliance, known as CAMA, C-A-M-A, an international aid organization, established CAMAcraft in 1976, tasked with helping self-help projects that refugees could work on to earn income while living in these Thai refugee camps. A few entrepreneurial Hmong had made their own efforts at selling textile pieces to camp workers and occasionally Thai tourists. Here you can see CAMAcraft still exists, some of their current offerings that are still available on their website. But the American founders of CAMAcraft were convinced that Hmong seamstresses needed assistance with product development, and they advised them to craft objects that would be familiar to Westerners, like aprons, pot holders, coasters, and Christmas ornaments. Some Hmong women had already begun making bed covers by stitching together squares of pandao, and they separated with strips of cloth, much like an American-style quilt. CAMAcraft encouraged production of this form, instituting standardized sizes it would hope to appeal to Western consumers. CAMAcraft marketers also dictated what colors and fabrics Hmong women should use in these pieces, suggesting color palettes that they thought would be pleasing. Hmong women of different clans living in the camps quickly learned from one another and integrated the new techniques in design, priding themselves on being able to quickly adopt new techniques and styles. In a practice that parallels the way Amish women chose patterns to make for the consumer market, designs that sold well soon spread among Hmong seamstresses working in these refugee camps. Church organizations sponsored many of the first Hmong refugees to the United States. In 1978, the Mennonite Central Committee, the Relief, Service, Development, and Peace Agency of the Mennonite and Brethren Church denominations, began settling Hmong refugees in the United States and Canada, with 30 families finding new homes in and near Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Other Hmong families were settled in nearby Philadelphia. As Hmong immigrant communities grew, with individuals becoming naturalized citizens, kin remaining in refugee camps were also able to emigrate. With poor English language skills and little transferable work experience or education, Hmong immigrants faced a difficult adjustment to life in the United States. Making pandao to sell naturally emerged as a viable means for Hmong women to contribute to their families' meager incomes, a practice that could fit in around other domestic responsibilities. Hmong immigrant communities across North America organized cooperatives and associations, often with the guidance of women volunteers from the sponsoring church and aid organizations, and they helped build consumer markets for pandao. But those living in southeastern Pennsylvania soon realized that a thriving market for handcrafted textiles already existed. Rather than shoehorn their traditional pandao into the established marketplace, some seamstresses decided to adapt their skills to fit the booming market for quilts. As Hmong women in Lancaster and the Lancaster area recount, in the early 1980s, one seamstress learned, perhaps from an Amish or Mennonite friend met through a local church sponsorship, how to construct the types of quilts local shops sold. Particularly ones that were of this applique style. This is in fact one of the country bride variations right here. When this woman started earning money for her fine applique skills, friends and relatives wanted to learn the practice too. Amish businesses had no qualms about hiring these newcomers to the community. As one quilt businesswoman said, quote, "We're all God's creatures. I'll take a chance with anyone," end quote. The reverse applique technique Hmong women used to make pandao was easily adaptable to the new sorts of applique quilts sold in Lancaster County's many shops, all inspired by this country bride fad. Hmong women, in fact, found making quilts much easier than their traditional pandao, since the technique was far less intricate. As Hmong women's reputation for fine applique work spread among Lancaster County quilt shops, these seamstresses found more and more work available to them as part of this complex putting out system that the Amish and Mennonites also participated in, where one woman would only make one portion of the quilt. So you might specialize in piecing or marking the design or doing the quilting or doing the binding. And for many Hmong women, it was the applique work. By one estimate, Hmong women living in southeastern Pennsylvania and their relatives in Asia did 99% of the applique work sold in Lancaster County shops by 1987. When asked about the difference between the work of Amish and Hmong seamstresses, one Amish quilt entrepreneur responded that the Hmong work was much better. Hmong quilt makers were also faster stitchers than their Amish and Mennonite counterparts. Some particularly skilled Hmong women strived to finish quilts from start to finish. They began making them on their own completely, cutting, piecing, appliquing, and quilting within 1 week, a pace most Amish women, or most women in general, most quilt makers in general, would not attempt. Like their Amish counterparts, most Hmong quilt makers earned far below the minimum wage, but they preferred sewing to factory work, the alternative employment for many. Hmong quilt makers liked working at home, the flexibility of fitting quilt making around other activities, and they could involve children and grandparents also in the activity. According to some estimates, by the late 1980s, nearly all Hmong women who were living in the southeastern Pennsylvania region near Lancaster County were working in some capacity for the quilt market. Making quilts paid better than making pandao, their traditional art, and Hmong women considered quilts much easier as well. Furthermore, there was already a market in place. People came to southeastern Pennsylvania to buy quilts, not to buy pandao. In 1989, a journalist reported that one Hmong woman earned $250 in one day by marking quilt designs, the quilting, the patterns where you would actually do the stitches on the quilts. In contrast, another Hmong woman who made pandao, the traditional work, she spent a whole week working on a very intricate wall hanging, and she hoped to sell it for $25. So for this reason, many southeastern Pennsylvania Hmong seamstresses had all but abandoned their own traditional needlework in favor of the more lucrative quilt making, even teaching their daughters to make country bride or double wedding ring quilts rather than to create the elaborately decorated ceremonial clothing. On the surface, Hmong quilt making practices appear to be a heartwarming example of adapting one's skills to new surroundings and creating a culturally hybrid quilt. Yet an ongoing tension existed. While Amish and Mennonite businesses were eager to employ Hmong seamstresses to do skilled applique work, they were often not so quick to acknowledge the Hmong contributions to their customers. Businesses selling quilts in Lancaster County recognized that the Amish identity of the makers was a huge part of the appeal to consumers shopping for quilts. Amish origins signified authenticity, even if this was only an imagined ideal. Most stores labeled Hmong applique quilts as Amish made, even if Amish women had only contributed the quilting. Other labels read made locally, which was a true statement, yet still a means of disguising the Hmong contributions. Although journalists and some scholars have written about the relationship between Hmong and Amish quilt makers, most tourists visiting the Amish were the primary customer base, no doubt had trouble imagining that the quilts that were sold here in this community could be made by anyone other than Amish quilt makers. Authentic quilts in Lancaster County were Amish quilts, no questions asked. In the late 1980s, Hmong quilt makers were caught between wanting credit for their contributions to the popular applique quilts sold at these shops and fears that such acknowledgement might backfire because it could jeopardize their relationship with the local businesses. In addition to seeking public acknowledgement as a source of ethnic pride, some Hmong women wanted to be free agents in the quilt market. They wanted to negotiate the pay rates on their own terms and sell directly to customers rather than having to go through an Amish or Mennonite middle person who would earn most of the profit off their needlework skills. These Hmong women wanted to band together to strategize how they could be treated better within Lancaster's quilt industry. But many other Hmong seamstresses did not want to risk losing this important source of income. According to some Hmong quilt makers at that time, Amish and Mennonite businesses warned them against trying to start their own businesses selling quilts, even implying that it was somehow illegal. Frustrated with the situation, one entrepreneurial Hmong quilt maker decided to disregard these warnings and opened her own retail outlet to sell both quilts and pandao. In 1990, Lo Mao Mua established Pennsylvania Hmong Crafts in Intercourse, Pennsylvania, the center of Amish-focused tourism in Lancaster County. Mua and her sister in Wisconsin appliqued many of the quilt tops and then contracted with Amish and Mennonite women for the quilting. So the tables were really turned. A Hmong entrepreneur now was hiring Amish women. Mua told a journalist, quote, "I tell my customers the truth. The quilt top is done by me, the quilting is done by Amish. Sometimes they already know, sometimes they don't care," end quote. In addition to quilts and small quilted objects, Mua also stocked pandao made by elderly Hmong women living in Pennsylvania and in other communities, or by Hmong who were still living in refugee camps in Thailand. Sometimes she integrated these pandao blocks, like you see here, into the quilts. Yet she discovered that running a retail outlet had its own challenges, including overhead costs. Paying rent in the very lucrative town of Intercourse dictated that Mua needed to charge more for her quilts while earning less profit. In 1997, she closed her shop, deciding to run her quilt business from her home, as many Amish seamstresses also did, continuing to sell the craft at her quilts at craft shows throughout the East Coast. Other women, including Pang Xiang Siratasuk, similarly stopped working directly for Amish and Mennonite quilt businesses in favor of selling or consigning completed quilts to retailers or at craft shows where she could keep all of the profit. She also wanted to publicize Hmong contributions to the popular quilts sold in Lancaster County. She even exhibited an Amish-style applique quilt, a Rose of Sharon, at a Philadelphia art gallery. The exhibit label read, quote, "Many times we made things and Amish people never said so. I just want people to know that I made this." Even more than Amish women, Hmong women were accustomed to adapting traditions. Many Hmong quilt makers became adept not only at using fine stitches to applique the motifs of country bride quilts, but also at creatively modifying these popular patterns with individual touches or inventing their own patterns. Lo Mao Mua added pieced corner elements to the country bride pattern to create what she called a country bride combination. Hua Yang copyrighted her Grape Galore pattern, a stylized wreath of grapes. And some quilt makers even combine aspects of pandao with patterns Amish quilt makers used to make their own, quote, old dark quilts. Tong Lor used purple squares of intricate pandao reverse applique to form the central motif of her center diamond quilt, flanking it with rich red and blue fabrics in this very favored Amish design from the early 20th century. Quilt making may not have been Hmong women's traditional textile art, but neither was it an Amish tradition before they had begun adapting it in the 19th century. Quilt makers from both cultures found ways to adapt the practice of making quilts into a personal expression and a saleable commodity. Unfortunately, many consumers visiting Amish country perceived a hierarchy of authenticity. Amish quilt makers made authentic quilts, they thought, while Hmong made inexpensive knockoffs. As Lo Malmoa, the proprietor of Pennsylvania Hmong Crafts, later told a journalist, quote, "Because I am Asian, they think I sell cheap imports." During the 90s and 2000s, inexpensive factory-made quilts, true cheap imports, and an apparent decline in consumer demand had brought down the prices of quilts sold in Lancaster County's quilt shops. By the early 2000s, many Hmong working in Lancaster County's quilt industry had become disappointed with the decreasing profits earned through quilt making. If consumers no longer sought out Amish quilts in great numbers, Hmong seamstresses could no longer consider stitching away on these so-called Amish quilts as a viable income. Some Hmong women began to outsource quilts themselves in hopes of earning more profit. Hmong quilt makers in Pennsylvania sent patterns and fabric for quilts to relatives and friends still living in Asia, then resold the finished products to wholesalers or auction houses in Lancaster County. In contrast to quilts made in Lancaster by either Hmong or Amish women, which tended to cost about $400 to actually make, in Thailand, similar quilts could be made for as low as $65 or $80. The practice of American Hmong outsourcing needlework from Hmong living in the Thai refugee camps was not new. Some entrepreneurial Hmong have been making buying trips to Thai refugee camps where they could buy pandao and bring it back to American consumers since earlier in the 1980s. One had even tutored Hmong seamstresses living in refugee camps on how to make the products appeal to Americans in order so that they could earn the most profit. She also taught some of these women how to make American-style quilts integrating pandao. But outsourced Hmong needlework sold not as pandao, but as locally made Amish quilts was something else. As the Allentown, Pennsylvania Morning Call newspaper reported in 2006 in a bit of an expose, no one knows for sure how many of these foreign-made quilts have been sold in Amish country. Rather than end up at many of the popular Amish-run quilt shops, many of them were sold at the New Holland Quilt and Craft Auction, which was held every 2 months in Lancaster County. It was sold, quilts at this auction were kind of sold almost on wholesale. People would come in and buy them in great numbers and take them back to their shops. They were often consigned, and the buyers would really have no way of knowing who had brought in what quilt to make. They just knew it was affordable. The auction's manager told a journalist that the flooded auction and the resulting prices, sometimes as low as $60 for an intricately appliqued quilt top, were causing tensions between the Hmong and the Amish in this community, who were both trying to survive in the quilt industry. Amish entrepreneurs blamed local Hmong quilt makers for inundating the market with too many quilts, not even really knowing that many of these were coming in from overseas from the Thai refugee camps. Other auctions, like the annual Gordonville Fire Company sale, which raised money to support the community's volunteer fire company, began limiting the number that any one individual could consign at the auction because some Hmong women were bringing in what they deemed too many quilts to sell. Some Amish and Mennonite quilt entrepreneurs felt like Hmong quilt makers were, quote, trying to take over a historical thing that's associated with Amish and Mennonites, despite the reality that most Amish and Mennonite quilt businesses had only begun 20 to 30 years earlier. A backlash occurred at some of the quilt shops in Lancaster that had in the past accepted quilts on consignment. With knowledge of the influx of foreign-made quilts growing among many entrepreneurs, businesses wanted more control over their product and began to commission more quilts on contract rather than accept any kind of undocumented consignment or wholesaled quilt. While it meant more work for quilt shop proprietors, it was a means for them of guaranteeing that quilts were indeed locally made. When the Allentown Morning Call published this series of articles making this connection well known between Hmong and Amish quilt makers, many readers responded with outrage. One called these quilts, quote, counterfeit. Another proposed a, quote, industry standardized label to identify the real German Amish Mennonite quilt because he did not want his, quote, quilt money subsidizing slave-like labor capos overseas. Ironically, he did not identify quilts as American, but as German, an attribution that overlooked the American origins of Amish and Mennonite quilt-making traditions. Once again, the imagined ideal of authenticity seemed to be at the forefront of how to value quilts. What was an authentic quilt? One Morning Call reader wrote in a letter to the editor, quote, "I'm shocked. My vision of sweet Amish women sitting in a quaint living room having a quilting bee has been destroyed." End quote. The reader considered Amish quilts authentic only if they conformed to her imagined ideal of how they were made. Peter Siebert, who was then director of the Lancaster Quilt and Textile Museum, which had a collection of old dark Amish quilts in simple geometric patterns, complicated the issue in the newspaper's online forum, which was one of the places where these heated discussions were taking place, questioning exactly what made an authentic Amish quilt. Siebert pointed out that Amish living in Midwestern settlements quilted some of the quilts that were then sold in Lancaster County. He asked, "Is that an authentic Lancaster quilt?" And he described quilts Amish made for their own use as undesirable to many consumers. He said, quote, "Most people would never own them. They incorporate fabric markers, crocheting, quilting, shiny fabrics, etc. This is not the country aesthetic that we associate with quilts." End quote. But as Siebert implied, perhaps these quilts, undesirable to consumers, yet made entirely by Amish makers according to Amish taste, were the real, authentic Amish quilts. If so, it seemed consumers would rather own ones perhaps even made in Thailand or purchased from a mail-order catalog that at least conformed to their imagined ideals of what an authentic Amish quilt should look like. Out of the conflict and controversy over Hmong contributions to quilt making in Lancaster County, one particular entrepreneur attempted to find harmony. An old order Mennonite quilt businesswoman named Emma Miller began to sell what she called harmony among the cultures quilts in the 1990s. These quilts celebrated Hmong needlework, acknowledging both the seamstress's skills and the beauty of traditional Hmong designs. These harmony among the cultures quilts were sold in the oldest quilt shop in Lancaster County. They were bed-sized quilts, which Whitmer describes as a combination of Amish and Hmong styles. They would feature the traditional pandao stitched by Hmong women in Thai refugee camps and sent to stateside relatives. Whitmer began acquiring these embroidered and reverse applique squares from some of her local Hmong seamstresses in 1995. They convinced her that by purchasing these squares, which take refugee women 6 to 8 weeks to make, she would be helping Hmong living in Thai camps, a prospect that suited Whitmer's religiously driven ethic of service. Whitmer designed the quilts in a commonly used setting for a repeated block quilt with neutral colored sashing separating the pandao blocks. Unlike many Lancaster quilt entrepreneurs, Whitmer had long been quick to acknowledge Hmong contributions on various of the quilts she sold in her shop, saying without hesitation that Hmong women did all the applique work. She valued her harmony quilts not only for their fine needlework and great composition, but because they represented the union of two cultural practices, each in a constant state of adaptation rather than of unchanging tradition. The customers that have bought Whitmer's quilts were not necessarily the art collectors who we met earlier, who loved the old dark quilts and hung them on the wall, and neither were they the casual tourists looking for souvenirs. These were consumers who really valued quality needlework, no matter what the ethnicity of the maker. I'd like to thank you so much for your attention this evening, and if we have time, I'm happy to take some questions.
What kind of thread does Mom use for that intricate needlework?
I am not certain. I do not know. I have not studied them as closely as objects of material culture, mostly as I haven't worked closely with a Hmong collection. I think they use some cotton and some like synthetic embroidery thread, but for the reverse applique, it's so intricate, I'm not sure.
So,
Maybe.
Where do you know the Hmong and the Amish
are we on a state of peace or are we getting?
That's a good question. I think in large part we are at a state of peace in Lancaster County area at least, in part because the quilt market has dipped so much overall. The Amish quilt businesses are not doing as well as they once did, and so there's less business to go around. Many Hmong have left southeastern Pennsylvania. There's a much smaller population there than there would have been 10, 15 years ago. Many have moved to more densely populated areas where there were larger Hmong refugee groups in Minnesota, in Fresno, California, I think in some areas of Michigan. So the population, I think it's become less tense, partly from out-migration and also because the quilt market has really changed.
Do you have an opinion as to why the quilt market has so much?
You know, I'm really puzzled over that. It seems not as many people are using bed quilts as they once did. I think, you know, inexpensive duvets and comforters are easier in many regards. You can launder them. They're easier to care for, easier to use. That said, quilt making as a whole in the United States, and I'm not sure, I believe it's also true in Canada, is bigger now than ever. More people are making quilts. I think more people enjoy the art and the process of making quilts themselves rather than necessarily buying someone else's quilt. Quilt making has really exploded, and it's a multi-billion-dollar industry now of all the fabrics and the gadgets and the sewing machines to produce it. I think some of it is also just an aesthetic difference. The sort of what I refer to as the American country aesthetic is no longer as popular as an interior decorating scheme. People still flock to Amish country in Lancaster County as tourists, but I think they're spending their money mostly at the outlets, buying clothes and shoes. Yeah.
I wonder if you could speak to the influence of the Welsh quilts on English quilts.
Sure. This is a fascinating question. There's been a lot of speculation that some Amish quilts bear a very strong resemblance to quilts made in Wales. This is particularly true of some of the quilts. We saw that Bars quilt, the one that I played the audio with that had the strips, that sort of strip quilt format. Also the center diamond was a very similar design to a Welsh traditional quilt. There's a British scholar named Dorothy Osler who has begun to do some real analysis, trying to figure out where this connection could have taken place. Those quilt styles I just mentioned are both from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. They don't really appear widely in the Midwestern Amish communities. So she looked at both Pennsylvania and at Ohio, looked at land plats to figure out where there were Welsh communities that butted up against Amish communities, where this could have taken place, what looks like an aesthetic connection between these quilt making styles. And she identified 3 potential communities where perhaps this overlap could have happened, but the timing never quite seemed right. What we know of when the Amish quilts were being produced and what we know of the Welsh quilts being produced. So it's a good theory that we need more research and more evidence. Again, I wish we just had a diary that said, I went to my Welsh neighbor's house and saw her beautiful quilt and I'm going to make one now. But the aesthetic similarity is so striking, really similar use of wool fabrics, similar quilting motifs even. It's hard to think that they just emerged completely separately, but at the same time, we don't know exactly how that transmission may have occurred in the 19th century probably. There was also a little bit of speculation whether it could have occurred somehow in the British Isles, but the Amish never really passed through there, so that is probably not likely at all. But it's an intriguing question, I think. Yes?
I too would like to thank you for this intriguing, complex picture with many twists and turns. I wonder if I could ask you to zoom in a little bit to talk about the value of quilts internal to the Amish culture of women, for instance,
Sure.
the function it played socially, and was there no pride
how you phrased that. Well, I think quilts have meant different things within the Amish community over time. I think in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, probably through into the 60s and 70s, quilts played such a special role in that they were an object that mothers made to send with their children when they left home. Weren't necessarily wedding presents per se, but they were given when you went to start your own household. You were sent off with quilts. Sometimes the mothers wouldn't necessarily make them themselves. One sort of misconception is that every Amish woman loves to quilt. Just like the rest of us, some Amish women love to quilt and they're really good at it, and sometimes they would pay a cousin or a neighbor or someone else to help make their quilts as well. But it was in this gift giving that I see the real significance of these quilts. And many of these quilts remained almost unused. They'd be tucked away in chests or only brought out on guest beds or when they hosted church in their homes. They were really special heirlooms, and they'd be passed down through multiple generations as well. And I think that's where a lot of the significance lied. Amish women tended to piece quilts by themselves, but then quilt together. So quilting is the finishing step of stitching the 3 layers of a quilt together. And that's what we think of as a quilting bee when we see people sitting around a frame. And so that was this great socially productive event where your aunts and your sisters would all come, and young girls would wait until they were old enough and skilled enough that they could participate at the quilting table as well. So it had a really special sort of ritual and tradition that it was a special event when you held a quilting. That began to change as quilts shifted into the consumer market. A lot of those same practices continued to occur, that you would still have your sisters and aunts and so forth over to quilt, but you would be making something that was intended for sale. And there was less, sort of in the mid-20th century in many communities, the younger generations would prefer a store-bought chenille bedspread than a quilt from home. And so the fashions changed. Then as Walmart comes into town, you can buy a cheap polyester comforter. It was much more practical, especially when you didn't have industrial-sized washing and dryers in your home. It was easier to care for a store-bought bedspread in some regard. So fashion changes, and quilts became much more associated with making something for the livelihood to sell in a shop rather than for home use. One more.
When you talk, you mentioned almost exclusively the Amish on the Hmong.
Could you speak up, please?
When you talk almost exclusively about the Amish and the Hmong. Are the Mennonites, when you say Amish, do you include Mennonites subconsciously?
Well,
Where are they with the
sure. The question is about where do the Mennonites fit in with the Amish and the Hmong in this sort of story. And there are some, depending on which region, there are some old order Mennonites that really participate in the Amish quilt market. In the United States, there is such a broad spectrum of Mennonites. I grew up Mennonite, but dressed like this and had electricity and cars and all sorts of things. And my foremothers made quilts, but never participated in the quilt market. There are some particularly old order Mennonites, Beachy Amish, which is a few steps down from the old order Amish. There are some conservative Mennonites who might participate also in the quilt market, but it's largely old order Amish in the United States that are the active participants in the quilt shops. And in some communities where, really only in Pennsylvania is there still much of an old order Mennonite community, a horse and buggy driving Mennonite community. So it really is Amish for the most part, but then there are some gradations of more conservative Mennonite groups. Mm-hmm.
Well, it's been a rich evening learning about quilts and Amish and Hmong and authenticity, and I'm really eager now to look closer at your book, as I'm sure everybody else here is as well. Thank you for coming to Waterloo County and talking about quilts. It's been wonderful to have you here as the Bechtel lecturer this year. I think we will take a few moments to take some pictures with the Bechtels if they're okay with that. And I invite the rest of you to move upstairs to the atrium to look at more quilts and to have some refreshments. And you can visit with Dr. Smucker and ask her more questions there. Please join me in thanking Dr. Smucker, and to all of you, thank you for coming tonight.